An activist of sorts in the trans community in Toronto. I'm presenting on a study that I did in 2012 with parents of gender non-conforming children, and specifically with affirming parents. So this is a group of parents who affirm their child's felt sense of gender, so through allowing their child to change their name, change their gender pronoun, go by no gender pronoun, dress the way they want in a variety of ways, and often in against all manner of social and legal punishments that can be there for these parents. And I'm in the interesting position of doing research in an area that is changing really, really rapidly. And so this research was done in 2012, and I think I have to disappoint you immediately by acknowledging that I think some of the claims I make in this paper are already not true in 2015. And it will come out in the Journal of Progressive Human Services in 2016, and then really not true at that point. Because things are actually changing very rapidly. And my doctoral work takes up what I think is, so this was my master's work I'm presenting on. My doctoral work takes up what I think is a really good that we're in, just within the past couple of years in terms of trans youth. But for this current paper, I focused on parents' knowledge of their child, affirming parents' knowledge of their child, because I was interested in what it would mean to call this knowledge, what questions we could then ask, and how we might assess that knowledge in relation to other more normative ways of knowing gender. So sociologist Tay Veto states that within the past century, we've seen a proliferation of ways to know gender. And despite that, what Garfinkel called the natural attitude, or what I would call the normative map of gender, persists, and it's a familiar story. So gender is said to be comprised of two distinct, easily distinguishable, non-overlapping, non-transferable, stable categories. They are separate. The relationship between biological sex and social gender is thought to be mechanical. Stryker said a real thing and its reflection. And there's no shortage of feminist and queer critiques of that. Those critiques are axiomatic at this point. That map sort of still structures power relations in the lives of gender non-conforming people and the parents of children. So in this study, I worked with Foucault and Butler's ideas about intelligibility, the concept of recognition as it's been theorized in the fields of political and moral philosophy, and to some extent psychoanalytic theory, and also Kenneth Gergen's concept of relational knowledge. So as a background, in the 1960s, the PSY professions, psychiatry and psychology, succeeded in expanding their boundaries to position themselves as presiding over children's gender contact. So that was new at that point. The kids that didn't conform, were mostly feminine boys at that point, were framed as pathological, as were their parents, and that was codified in the DSM in 1980, the Diagnosis of Gender Identity Disorder in Children. And the historical conditions that sort of gave rise to that are very, very interesting, or they're interesting to me. I don't have time to go into them right now. But at that point in the 60s, pathologizing treatment programs were launched where parents were instructed to guide their children through behavior modification, to guide their children into normative roles, and which really traded on the idea that this was a fantasy solution. Well, it traded on science, really, science and health, ideas of scientific authority. And the idea that for children to identify as another gender or to simply behave as what is thought to be another gender was a fantasy solution for some other disorder that they had, and the disorder sort of spread to the family, to the parents, often the mother. And so a very small number of researchers and clinicians developed a tremendous amount of authority and influence in this area that's hard to describe unless you know these people. And that global epicenter for these kind of corrective programs is Toronto, so that's the context that I'm working in. I spent a lot of time trying to do something about that. So within the past decade that we've seen a new movement, so clinicians and parents and activists who are reversing all of the former truth claims of those experts who are sort of demanding support for gender non-conforming expressions as sort of healthy life projects, as valid human trajectories. And so it's two very opposing views, and which one is the majority at this point depends on where you look and who you ask. But what's important to know is that both of them purport to help, and both of them respond to the same phenomenon, which is, I would say, like encounters with difference. Whereas probably would say when you feel your anger go, so encounters with difference in some cases. So in recent years, we've seen an explosion of media attention about parents who are affirming their children. And these parents in 2012, they were reporting some positive responses from others. They were also reporting judgment, anger, disapproval, disbelief by service providers, who in some cases had a lot of authority in their lives. Teachers, child welfare workers, etc. They reported loss of family and friends, some cases entire families that could not get on board with what the decision that parents were making, and threats to or outright loss of child custody. So those parents really stepped outside of what was intelligent to other people, and this study is an exploration of the knowledge that underlies realize that decision to step outside of that potential. So I did 10 interviews with a total of 15 parents across several cities in Canada, and I'm not going to describe much about the participants for the sake of time, but the vast majority were middle class. Roughly 10 of 15 identified as white, with sort of 5 other racial or ethnic identities that included First Nations, mixed race, Latino, Japanese, French Canadian. And the extent to which my findings reflect some white or middle class values or culture, I think, is an important question. It's not one that I answer in this paper, but I invite your comments about that. So the interviews focused on parents, how they came to understand their child's gender. So my specific question was, how do you know what you know about your child? And during the analysis, it became really obvious that they had actually answered a different question than the one that I asked. I had panicked about that. And then realized that actually the gap between what I asked and what they answered was the story of the research. And that was actually what was meaningful about it. So I asked them how they knew their child's experience of gender, but they reported actually that their child's gender was evolving, it was in flux, it was nothing like their own, it was actually unknowable. They didn't know. So they told a story not about knowing, but a story about how they responded in the face of not knowing. And so I'll share a few of the findings. So most of the parents began parenting intending to challenge gender norms, sort of what they saw as old-fashioned stereotypes, and so they saw their child's first expression of difference as unremarkable or as positive. But then for all of them there was a threshold that got crossed over into some kind of new zone, and things took on a certain gravity, and so they each describe that moment differently. It was, in some cases, it was a daughter, a little girl decided to shave her head, or in another case, the parents said, crossing the department store aisle and shopping for my son in the girls' side of the department store. It was the crossing of a threshold that then was no longer just in the realm of feminist parenting. It was something new, and they used the term big deal repeatedly to talk about what was going on. So they had conflicts with the external world. 2 families were visited by child welfare authorities and were investigated for abuse for allowing their child to dress in the way that the child saw fit. One parent had the experience of having a group of other parents mobilized to keep their child out of the school, so we don't want your child in the school. So there were these external conflicts, and then there were these internal conflicts that were encounters with their own biases, and some of them described it as a totally alien experience. So one of the mothers said, "It's a feeling you can't explain to other people that haven't been there. How terrifying that feeling is of not understanding, not knowing, confusion. I feel like I'm on a different planet trying to figure out a different species." So I used the concept of recognition to theorize how these parents were responding to these encounters with difference and not knowing. And so recognition, the concept of recognition comes from Hegelian philosophy, or philosophical theory, where it was imagined as the ideal reciprocal relationship between human beings, separate yet equal, and a necessary precondition to non-violence. So Hannes notes in the 80s and the 90s, recognition began to become sort of new grammar. He says that social justice claims what he referred to as the ultimate paradigm of justice. And there's a hot debate about whether or not that is true, but it's understood by some theorists to be fundamental to justice. For psychoanalytic thinkers, they're interested in the conflict that emerges when parents confront the independent selfhood of their child as in opposition to their mental fantasy of who that child is. And aggression is one response, and there's certainly a number of studies that show high rates of violence from parents towards gender non-conforming children, violence being a very material form of aggression. But we also see the continuation of these psychological treatment regimes to correct children, to convert them, which we can think of as a sort of a more symbolic form of aggression. So I proposed in this study that recognition is the counter-response that these parents were offering through a number of gestures. The first of them was refusing to problematize their child. So despite pressure to find fault with their child in all of these conflicts that came up with family, school, all of these places, these parents refused to do so. So one father said, "It's everything around her that's a problem. It's not her." And some of the parents literally did battle with everything around their child. So one mother said, "We have to take on the school system, the medical system. We have to be ready to move, to lose loved ones. We must be willing to change schools and be ready for homeschooling if necessary." Another step in the recognition process was looking for a new reality where their child's difference could mean otherwise. So with service providers, there were a few positive experiences to be had. There were many, many negative experiences where providers overstepped their bounds and overestimated the relevance of their own opinions. So a mother whose child had transitioned from male to female reported, "We took her to see this person who was supposed to be working with her to find her voice and self-esteem and confidence. The therapist actually came to us and said, 'I see Robin more as a boy.' And I said, who the fuck asked you? Which I think is a great question. She said, who the fuck asked you? That's not your job. You weren't asked to decide whether you think Robin feels more like a boy or a girl to you. So importantly, this group of parents were actually not swayed by these encounters. They just looked elsewhere. If they could, if the person didn't have significant authority or power in their life, they brushed them aside, looking for someone else who actually could recognize their child. So within pathologizing treatment programs, I've mentioned the hierarchies of authority have been really explicit. So parents are literally trained by clinicians, sometimes with an earpiece in their ear, with a clinician behind glass. The parents are trained to train their child. So the hierarchy is very clear. And in contrast, these parents challenged adult authority in all kinds of ways. They took on support or facilitator roles instead of roles of authority. One mother talked about a conversation she had with her daughter when she was 4. She said, how do we make me a boy? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, why don't you go talk to some people? So the mom went on to say, she recognizes our limitations and she's very kind about them, but she will outsource. And then other children directly challenged their parents' authority. So one mother was uncertain of how her husband's family was going to respond to her son wearing a dress. So she asked her son to dress in a more conventional way for family outings. But at one point, her son challenged this and she conceded. So at some point he said to us, well, if they're my family and they love me, they need to accept me for who I am. I said, yeah, right. So that letting go of authority required acknowledging the children as subjects with their own will, so i.e. the child is not me. My mother said this is their story. We need to not see them as extensions of ourselves. And despite the stigma that's attached to transgender lives, and that continues, almost every parent was holding open the possibility that their child might transition one day to another gender, or might be something other than a boy or girl. So one mother said, she gets that there's stuff you can do to make yourself fit better, to make things make sense. She's not there yet, but I just want her to have that sort of comfort. So this is a direct challenge to professionals who see or saw transition as a negative outcome, as the worst outcome. So parents recast it with what I would call an embodiment framework. They use words like comfort, fit, and sense-making. And they challenge their own transphobia. So one mother said, I was able to go back and say whatever the outcome is, it's okay. Whatever the outcome is, it's right. Not just okay, right, because the important thing is that you are who you need to be. Sorry. So as I mentioned, parents didn't feel that they knew their child's experience of gender, but there was something that they were certain of. So they said, I know what I need to do. One of them said, I know I'm right. They even banged on the table when they said it. They said, I know I'm right. And to explain that, they talked about a process of attuning to what their child was communicating through words sometimes, but often through affect, or through soma, through the body. So they said, I know what my child needs from me, but I know it through our relationship, not through an external source of knowledge. They described children that lit up and glowed when they referred to them with their gender pronoun or their chosen name. And then conversely, children that were, in their words, robotic or lifeless when they insisted on referring to them as their birth sex. In some cases, they described children literally falling to the floor when they misgendered them. And one mother was forced by child protection workers to refer to her trans daughter as he, him. She was told she would lose custody of the child. She did not refer to the child as he or him. And she said, how do we know? Well, it's like the light goes out of her eyes. So when these parents get maligned by professionals or by other people, the charge is one of incompetence. So they fail to properly guide their children, so they failed at their job. One mother was reflecting on that common truth, and that parenting is a hard job. Parenting is the hardest job. And she said, yeah, actually parenting is not a job, it's a relationship. So what does this mean? I think it's obvious that there's a conflict, or there's a big deal, words parents provided, surrounding gender non-conforming children. It's obvious that there's two very opposing responses working in different knowledge systems. So one being that gender non-conformity is pathological deviation that needs objective guidance and correction. And the other being that gender non-conformity is an expression of another person's subjective reality that is recognized and understood through relationship, and both of those knowledges purport to help. You could simply say that the pathologizing approach is wrong. I'm often heard saying that, but I was interested in other ways of evaluating those as competing truth claims. Kenneth Gergen was a social psychologist who devoted his career to entrenching critique of objectivity. And for Gergen, all knowledge develops in relationships, so he referred to knowledge as perishable. That accuracy has a shelf life, he said, it deteriorates over time. So he proposed that we evaluate knowledge not based on accuracy at all, but on pragmatic outcomes. So based on, evaluate knowledge based on its reverberations in cultural life, based on what it makes possible and what it forecloses. So in that frame of the question, the important question is not is this knowledge correct, but where does it take us, or what does it do? So I'll end by just trying to quickly answer that question. With the clinicians who claim that children who sort of cross-identify with another gender, that it's a fantasy solution, they are proposing there, right, that it's a fiction. That it's a fiction opposed to a reality that they know that they have access to. And so what that knowledge system makes possible is the consolidation of expert authority that gets wielded over these families. On the other hand, these parents that I've talked to, by refusing to problematize their child, they were demanding places of belonging for their kids. By searching out affirming communities, affirming service providers, they desacralize professional knowledge. By relinquishing authority over who their children could be, they challenge the notion of parenting as job and child as product. And in responding to their children's otherness without aggression, they open up the possibility of doing justice to difference. So in light of these two contested views, Hill and Mendier call for a stronger base in science to support the affirming approach. I won't argue that goal. Actually, I think it's probably a useful one, but it's not my goal. I think we need a stronger base. Justice is what I've been proposing to the field of clinicians who work with trans children. And I think that the concept of recognition helps us get there. So Hannah says that justice demands that we can all have confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem, but we don't develop these as a solo ego project. We develop our beliefs about ourselves in the context of other people's beliefs about us to a staggering degree. Sartre said the road to interiority passes through the other. So affirming parents what they made possible for their children was to trust their own sensations as reliable indicators of who they are and what they need. And they respected their children in Kantian terms as the authors of the laws to which they were subject. So an implication of the study is that we can consider the response to gender non-conforming children not only as a matter of health as it's currently understood in the medical world, but as a matter of justice and the potential of these parents as social justice practitioners. So I'm going to end there.